we can finish the text if we want to.
Okay, thanks. I'm still panting from this one.
Panting in a good sense.
Yes,
Yeah,
absolutely.
yeah. Even the Decameron, we only read about a third of it. You know, those will all be fun to go back and do. And same thing with Chaucer, we just a portion. So those all can be done again.
Okay, thanks.
Sure. Actually, if you look at the email I sent out with all the upcoming series, in all of those cases, I know some of you already signed up for some of them. You know, I'm intending them to be a series, truly, right? So if it's Thucydides or something, that we're going to go through all 8 books, you know, or those other things. So yeah, look for those things coming in the future. So I wonder if we could start at the foreword as a way of digging into this. So for us, in this, the translation that most of us have, I think it's page 3, but it doesn't have a page number at the top. And it starts off, in the name of God, the compassionate, the merciful, in him I trust. Okay, so I'm going to read the second paragraph. To proceed, I should like to inform the honorable gentlemen and noble readers that the purpose of writing this agreeable and entertaining book is the instruction of those who peruse it, for it abounds with highly edifying histories and excellent lessons for the people of distinction, and it provides them with the opportunity to learn the art of discourse as well as what happened to kings from the beginnings of time. This book, which I have called The 1001 Nights, abounds also with splendid biographies that teach the reader to detect deception and to protect himself from it, as well as delight and divert him whenever he is burdened with the cares of life and the ills of the world. It is the supreme God who is the true guide. So I guess what I would encourage is, as we're reading these stories and talking about it, here's what it's supposed to be, and we can decide, is it that or not? Okay. So then what I would love to do now is just get us to the prologue. And I guess I want to ask kind of a general question, which is, do we have affection for these 2 royal brothers? Do we have sympathy with them? Do we understand them? Do we have any affection for them?
Interesting question.
Yes.
That's my job, asking interesting questions.
I
Not answering them.
I think it changes as you move through the text.
Okay.
But there is a propensity, is that the correct word, for the more challenged brother. I can never keep their names straight. I look at them from the last part, the last syllable of the name.
Yeah, Shaman is the younger one, and right.
Rayar and Rosad. That's how I.
Shahryar, yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I thought it was kind of interesting that the one brother, Shahrazad, would feel so much better that his brother had it even worse than he did.
Isn't that say more? I was so struck by that.
Yeah, and I mean, it just made it. It brought back his appetite. It was all we need is a little more misery in this world.
So what I was thinking, it's for us, it's at the bottom of page 6, and it's just like the second page of this prologue.
Mm-hmm.
About 4 lines from the bottom, he says, this is Shazaman, if I'm pronouncing that right. But whenever he found himself alone, this is after he's already gone to his brothers and he found his wife and killed her. Whenever he found himself alone and thought of his ordeal with his wife, he would sigh deeply, then stifle his grief and say, alas, that this great misfortune should have happened to one in my position. Then he would fret with anxiety, his spirit would sag, and he would say, none has seen what I have seen. In his desperation, he ate less and less, grew pale, and his health deteriorated. So, and your point was, when he saw the misery in someone else, it made him feel better.
Yes, much better. His appetite came back, and he was a happy fellow again.
Is that what commiserate means?
I think that's what Schadenfreude means.
Well,
Right.
What,
go ahead.
what's I find surprising, and maybe it's a cultural thing, of course, is that these two brothers who so adore each other and get together and spend all this time together, they never talk about their feelings. And the younger one, Bernard, doesn't tell Riyar Shah anything about the reason of his departure from his own kingdom and all of that, which is sort of interesting. And that they spend all this time together and go hunting and do all these things for months, I believe it says, or something, a couple of months. And nothing is mentioned until much later. Zaman Shah and Riyar. Yeah. That was interesting to me, but of course they're busy with hunting and exchanging presents and royal gifts and all of that in a very wonderful custom for the times and their position in life.
Would you say that he doesn't tell him why he's distraught. He was planning to go there anyway, right? That his older brother summoned him and he wanted to go, but I guess I wondered, not only was he desperate, but it's kind of embarrassing in a way, right? To have your spouse be cheating on you with the kitchen boy, I guess.
Yeah.
Part of me, now I only got to tale 50, it's just full disclosure. So I don't know how everything turns out, but part of me wanted to say, oh gosh, this is so misogynistic, they get angry, they kill their wives, and I didn't want to relate to them. But at the same time, part of me was thinking, well, they both have this notion or this ideal about what a king should be. And when you fall short of an ideal, whether it's being an ideal king or even an ideal like merchant or whenever you fall short of your goals, I think there's a certain amount of disappointment and at some point to realize that you're not alone in that. I thought that was somewhat comforting.
So that's.
I don't approve of the responses, but.
Barry, what are you going to respond?
Well, I'm thinking that that this is really the wrap for the entire set of stories, and when we look at it, I think it is misogynistic. It's also narcissistic, and I'm sure it'd be disappointing to come on your wife in bed with another fellow, but killing her is kind of an extreme response, and then preemptive killing of a whole bunch of young women is kind of over the top for most of us.
He does say, this is at the bottom of page 7, just a page away from where I was. Now this is the older brother, and he says, while Shahzaman looked at them without being seen, they continued to walk until they stopped below his window without looking in his direction, thinking that he had gone to the hunt with his brother. Oh wait, sorry, I'm in the wrong space. Hold on. That's not. I meant to say bottom of page 9.
Okay.
5 lines from the bottom. So he tells his brother what happens, and the brother says, the older brother, by God, had I been in your place, I would have killed at least 100 or even 1,000 women. I would have been furious. I would have gone mad. So Barry, you're thinking, did he go mad?
I'm thinking that there's a set of social mores that have changed, and certainly from the perspective of the women on the line, I think they've changed for the better. And it's a little bit difficult to get into the mindset that says, okay, I'm gonna kill a bunch of women because I'm upset. I'm not sure that I want to get into that mindset, but I think that it's an understood in the wraparound story that these guys have the right and almost the obligation to defend their honor by killing people.
I mean, originally I was really troubled by the violence against women, and I felt it was like openly misogynistic also. But by the middle, which is where we are, by that part, I feel my opinion really changed over time because it felt like she was kept telling him stories about forgiveness or about redemption or about why someone might commit adultery. And each time it's kind of like she's pleading her case through a story. And by the end, or by the middle, I started to feel, no, I could almost feel some early feminist argument for why you shouldn't be killing women indiscriminately. And so where at the beginning I was really struggling with that and felt like, really violent, really awful.
Dong Yu, you were going to try to come in.
Yeah, I was trying to say whether he
was,
has some special understanding of time or not.
added information.
Because he owning.
Hold on one second.
Sorry, I wonder whether he has any special understanding of time or not. Because he only has a new wife for one night, right?
Yeah.
And killed the new wife the second day.
Right.
That kind of span of time will make the wife loyal. It's longer. Chances of cheating on him.
Right.
His trust is very short.
Yeah.
Just one night.
Dave.
Well, I think.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
Yes, please.
Yeah. I think the idea is that he marries a virgin and he wants to make sure that she doesn't have a chance to sleep with another man.
Right.
But interestingly, I mean, we're bound to put over this our perspective, who we are now. But for the time, I think as repelling as the brutality can be, it's part of the times. And I think it's sort of interesting to allow that, all that brutality, not that we like it or condone it or any of that. And of course the premise is he wants a wife, he wants a virgin, he wants her to be faithful. I mean, both kings expect that. Meanwhile, they have their concubines and all of that running around, and nobody questions that naturally, because that's part of a culture and that's part of a time. And I think it's hard to dismiss that from where we are now. But
Sean?
Well, you know, I'm looking at page 12 right now in the book, and it's where the brothers run into the demon and the girl.
Yeah.
And it's an interesting encounter because it's coming right after the two brothers have killed their wives, right? And you look at those relationships, but I don't see them as loving relationships. I see them as power arrangements. And it's interesting because one of the women's big crimes is they're having affairs with slaves and people of lower station or lower power levels. Right. And there's a fascinating juxtaposition because now you have these powerful men who are put in a position of a lower order to that of the demon, and the girl saying, "Hey, come have an affair with me." Oh, you know, and they find themselves in the exact same position that the slaves were in with their wives. And so it's an interesting change of role. Yeah. And maybe there's a commentary on how to exercise power somewhere in that, or maybe there's something in I don't know, maybe the word, I like the word commiseration now again, you know, maybe there's a way that there's some type of understanding that's starting to develop in that instance, or in multiple instances like that. Yeah.
May I?
Please. Yeah.
May I just add a little color to the beginning of what Andy provided? So I'm not an expert on this text. I am Iranian, and some of these names are Iranian.
Oh yeah.
So Shah Rayan and Shah Zaman. Shah means king. Mm-hmm. And then Zaman means time. So like the king of all time. Like think about, again, how Andy started us off, which is like the king of all time has this incident happen to him and then thinks this couldn't have ever happened to anybody else. So it's kind of a commentary on the nature and the wisdom of that person too, to have that juxtaposition of the name. Yeah. And his brother is Shahrayar, which is the king of wisdom. So as we're speaking, to have those like huge names be on top of these two characters, and as Andy mentioned, you know, in the prologue, that this would be the edification for distinguished people and for kings to show, I think as Sean said, the highs and the lows, like the follies, you know, that can come with being overtaken possibly by such strong circumstances.
Yeah.
Do you think there's any significance in reference to what you're clarifying? It says the story of king.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't say the story of kings. Do you think there's any significance to that?
Well, it seems like the younger brother leaves the picture pretty fast, right?
Mm-hmm.
So he's no longer considered a king.
Well, I don't know that he's not considered a king, but it's not about him anymore.
But his name still signifies him as king.
Yeah.
He goes out into the world with that name.
You know, it's interesting that this is a bit of a tangent, but in Iran, history is the story of kings. And so even when we in high school would learn about history, it would be a long time before you would get facts. In the beginning, because it's such a long dynasty, you would get the story of kings. And so to kind of reference it in relationship with this book is even the way the culture holds its history is through stories of these kings or these individuals. I mean, I don't know what more to say about that, but I just wanted to add that as a whole nother level of, we don't have dates like an Egyptian, you know, we don't have scrolls and dates or events. We would have had these stories of these high kings and these low kings and these actions and these conquests and these accomplishments. And so I feel like that some of that is in here and in this text that we can talk about.
Mm-hmm.
Do you
Mary
all?
Jane. Go ahead, Mary Jane.
I'd like to point out something. If on page 11, about the middle, King Shahara says, "No one is safe in this world. Such doings are going on in my kingdom." So there's a sense in which he's responsible for the moral order of this kingdom. He's been a very bad ruler because somehow, you know, with all the spies he has, with all the control, etc., and yet right under his nose, these deeds are going on that are completely out of bounds.
Yeah.
So, so I just want to throw that out because I think maybe that ties into this idea of kingship, that he's responsible. He's, you know, he is tasked by God with preserving the moral order of his kingdom.
Mm-hmm.
And we see that later, Mary Jane, in some of the later stories where the king asked the vizier with the stolen apple, like, how could this be happening without my knowing it in my kingdom? This is not okay. And so the idea of, if I can't even keep the affairs in my household in order, how could I have any shot at being a good king? So it has that family life and that king life really connected. So it's a different way of looking at it than saying he just loved her or he was just upset. That these things are tied together in a very real way.
Yes.
And it's interesting that God as Almighty is invoked quite often, especially when they encounter the demonic and the
But Roxana, I guess one thing is there's not just in this text, but there's such a long tradition of the kings and the land being connected and all that kind of stuff, right? And order. And then I guess what I would wonder is the king could certainly say and should say, how is this happening? You know, how can I keep things in order when right under my nose things aren't in order? But then the flip side is when this happens and they're completely surprised, are they just being naive that things, like in other words, people have affairs. Right. And so not everybody, of course, but to say, oh, I can't believe that it's happening. And to go back to what Anka said, I was trying to think of a modern example. So it's like, let's say you got hurt in love, right? So then you say, I'm never going to love again. I'm just going to get laid and then split, you know, that'd be like kind of a modern equivalent. So that's the reaction about trying to keep things in order is you're not going to get hurt.
I think to make the metaphor complete, though, Andy, you'd have to say, I'm just going to get laid and then kill her.
I know. The modern example is muted.
I think it's a certain loss of innocence on his part. the comment about his relationship to power and within his kingdom, it's valid, and I hadn't thought about that. Thanks for mentioning that. But to me, it seems like the cry of a heart that comes out of him, it's more his sense of loss of innocence.
Yeah.
And so he goes after that to avenge that, to try to, he doesn't know how to love, the way we would call it. And so it becomes this, it's just a carnal relationship and then the murder. So it gives him power, it gives him control. It's all about control in a way. And that's the way I see it. Of course, if we think about all the innocent women and maidens he kills, and the poor vizier bringing everybody night after night, and boom, in the morning, Vayataga, and boom, and says, oh my God, what horror. But I think it's just a metaphor for his loss of innocence and his desire to make up for it by changing the physical circumstances in which he might otherwise be betrayed.
Yeah.
I would tend to characterize it more as an abandoning of morality than a loss of innocence, because they seem to have some moral sense to, to be outraged that something would happen to them, and then to go on his killing spree and have the daughters of, and it starts to affect the whole society. The daughters, I'm looking at the bottom of page 14, the second to last paragraph, where it says, he continued to do this until all the girls perished, their mothers mourned, and there arose a clamor among fathers and mothers who called the plague upon his head and complained to the creator of heaven and called on him who hears and answers prayers. So it seems to me a little bit more than just a loss of innocence. It seems to me an abandonment, a total abandonment of morality, which was, I don't know, in some ways acceptable because his position.
Well, you're bringing up a good point. It seems to me that if his job is to take care of the kingdom, this is not the way to do it. Right? The kingdom can't flourish this way.
And curiously enough, that the protagonist is going to be a woman who comes and corrects this.
Yeah.
As the hand of
you going to
God
say something a minute ago? Oh, she turned herself off.
All these people that fall so deeply in love, and it changes their whole life. They've only seen this person for a minute. They don't know them at all. So, and that happens for both the men and the women. They're madly in love.
So I was going to say, when you're kind of, the initial question was, how do we feel about the brothers? And setting aside what they did, killing all those people was horrible, and, all the double standard and everything, I actually feel kind of compassion, because the part that Sean just read, and someone else kind of made this point too, is that they're sort of born into the fact that they're nobility. They have all this responsibility, but they also have this essential social contract with the community. Because if they're not providing for the people, and we see this actually in different countries and stuff, if the people there in sort of that ruler role are not honoring their part of it and somehow making people's lives better, they're at risk of being ousted or possibly overthrown or whatever. So, and the reason I think it's significant here is that here you have these people that are supposedly like smarter and wiser in their nobility, and it really sets a nice groundwork for learning from these stories, because it says, oh my gosh, if this person is in such desperate need of help, then perhaps we all can learn from this.
Or perhaps there's a commonality, they're just like us, is maybe another suggestion. Yeah, that's fascinating.
I did some math though that causes me to withhold my compassion. I ended up reading this in two translations, and in the one, the king has a new woman every night and kills her the next night. So with my pocket calculator, I figured out that he killed 1,095 women before he gets to one who can hold a shiny object in front of its face and cause him to get distracted until the next day. I think if we look at that as a metaphor, then it's a way of getting somebody who is a dangerous ruler back on track, because having gone awry, he's really become quite dangerous. But it's really hard for me to feel sorry for a mass murderer.
Yeah.
And isn't it fascinating?
I was just going to say, to be fair, you guys, I was a public defender for a year, so I have this huge well of compassion. So I mean it as I see them as incredibly broken. So yes, I agree. Mass murderer too.
Well, I think it sets up Shahrazad, and I'm curious to know if her name means something now as well. But how do you speak to someone who has power over you, who's doing bad things, and you can't force them to stop? I mean, that really does set the groundwork for something very interesting, and something kind of, you know, something that has to become internalized by the powerful. And, you know, how do you do that? So the forward about diplomacy and stuff is I see echoes of that, and perhaps you know, for those of us who aren't in positions of power, a little bit of hope.
Yeah, that's good. Hey, I wanted to. Oh, go ahead.
Also, talking about power, I remember the second to the last story, there was another wife cheated on the husband, and that kind of tension finally was reconciled by a king, right? But here, first in the beginning of the story, one of the brothers' wife cheated on him, and he is already a king. It's harder to find someone more powerful than him to reconcile this kind of tension.
Yeah.
In that case, it seems that death, a murder to his wife, was expected.
Yeah, that's right. I was just going to read this line and see what you guys thought about it. I did a little survey, and I'll see what you think. It's on page 13, and it's right in the middle of the page here, and it was the demon's wife, and she's saying, he has, about maybe 15 lines from the top, he has guarded me and tried to keep me pure and chaste, not realizing that nothing can prevent or alter what is predestined, and that when a woman desires something, no one can stop her. So I did a little survey, and I said, what do you guys think about this sentence? And they said, well, the first part I'm not so confident in about the predestined, but the second part, absolutely, that's the way it is. My little survey. So I'm curious, when a woman desires something, no one can stop her. What do you guys think of that?
Depends on the woman.
Admit to it.
Yeah. Really depends on the woman. Sorry.
Well, we can start with the example of Shahrazad. Her father did try to stop her. So how does that story begin? I mean, I think it's important that she wasn't just the next in line. She volunteered herself.
Yeah.
And her father, who was second in the line of power, all he could do in his position was to just feed these women to her, and then to the king, and then try to keep his own daughter last. So maybe we could talk a little bit about her and see if anything comes out of that.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Anka?
Yeah, thanks, Roxana. I think at some point, and there is a point that's made about the fact that Raya Shah, like so much, loves his vizier, and so he exempts him from putting his daughters in the killing line. So her volunteering, which I'm glad you're bringing, is quite extraordinary. But she feels, I'm looking for the text right now. I have it online here. Bear with me 1 second, where it goes, where the introduction of her, where is it? And where it says that she's so well read. Okay, now it's page 14 at the bottom. Now, as mentioned earlier, the vizier who put the girls to death had an older daughter called Shahrazad and a younger one called Dinarzad. The older daughter, Shahrazad, had read the books of literature, philosophy, and medicine. She knew poetry by heart, had studied historical reports, and was acquainted with the saying of men and the maxims of sages and kings. She was intelligent, knowledgeable, wise, and refined. She had read and learned. I think this is so important because basically she believes in the power of a story. She believes so much that she's going to be able to work a miracle by enrapturing the Shah into her storytelling. She believes so totally in the power of the story, but she throws her life in the game for it.
She doesn't do it alone.
I think it's extraordinary. That thing is totally extraordinary.
But she says to her father, but I will answer your question by marrying the king and my behavior with the king.
Right.
So, and then did he educate his other daughters or were they as intelligent as Scheherazade? Do we have any information on the rest of the harem?
Well, on the bottom of 20, after the tale of the donkey and the merchant and his wife, and her dad's like, I'm going to beat you into submission. And she's like, well, if you do that, I'm going to tell the king you refuse and he's going to kill you. So she kind of plays a power game with him. But I was kind of, and I love her first line is, I will speak my mind to you, Father. I loved that too.
So that's really important, Sean. I think that's a good point, because when we get the description of the vizier below where Anka read, it says the vizier who could not refuse the king. And so now we have a daughter who is openly a female in this book, which in every mood of the book is an inferior position, volunteering herself, armed with these like new modalities of healing and medicine and culture, and about to go against her father, who's the second in command. Sorry to interrupt.
Well, and she doesn't do it alone. And I don't know if this is where the predestined comes in or not, but certainly her sister is involved. And I'm at the bottom of page 20. And she says to Dinarzad, she says, sister, listen well to what I'm telling you. When I go to the king, I'll send for you. And when you come, see that the king is finished with me and say, sister, if you're not sleepy, tell us a story. And then I'll begin to tell a story and it will cause the king to stop his practice, save myself and deliver the people. And Dinarzad said very well. So she's knowingly not going into this alone. And it did strike me, how consistent Dinarzad was in her role. I mean, it was, and it sucked me, and I kept I'm still getting pulled into each tale. I'm like, it's still happening. So.
Yeah, I think that allows an interpretation when you add them into the frame. In the king, you've got this guy who's completely out of control, which sounds realistic. And then you've got women who know that they're smarter than him, outsmarting him.
Right.
Her name means, she also has the name Shah, the king in her name, Shahrazad. Her name means either born from beauty, but it has this notion of being from the city or being cosmopolitan. So it's kind of like all of the gifts of civilization and learning. So if something is gonna mollify this, like, nobody goes against king, it's gonna be this new way of civilization that comes through story and a woman.
Right.
So, yeah, because I was struck. I thought there seemed to be a vacuum around this king. He doesn't have the kind of civilized expert advisors around him. He seems to be alone. It's interesting that this woman, and I kept thinking of either perhaps Esther or notion of Sophia, something like that, stepping up to the plate almost to fill that vacuum.
That's a good point. Do you feel we should maybe go to this first arc?
We're never gonna.
No, that's totally fine.
Great, it's great.
It's well, maybe. Oh, go ahead.
Andy, before we go, Roxana, would you repeat again what Shah means in the feminine?
King.
No, king, but then you went on in reference.
Oh, so the second part of her name means Reza. It just means to be like worldly or cosmopolitan, but it also has this affinity for being born of culture or beauty.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm really happy that you're saying those words, because they add so much to the story, right? And that makes, I mean, it even kind of responding to Paula for a second, it didn't even seem like the father, the vizier, trained the daughters. It looks like she did it herself, right? She read these books. So here's this very go-getter, intelligent, clever person that saves the day.
And it
Question
says
before we.
she sat on his throne. I mean, wow. She sat on his throne and he let her?
What?
I'm not understanding what you're saying, Paula.
Well, page 14, right in the middle, started, and she sat on his throne and ordered his visor. I mean, she was given power to even be allowed to sit on his throne, or am I not?
That's the king.
Oh,
Sat on his throne.
oh, wait a second. Oh, I am the brother Baden. I set up.
That's the king.
Thank you.
That's okay.
For that clarification.
Sean, what were you going to say?
I was just wondering, because I'm not familiar with Farsi at all, but is there some kind of contrast or connection between Razad and Ra'ir, like wisdom and cosmopolitan? Is there?
I don't know much. I wouldn't be able to say more about that either.
Oh, okay.
And I want, and I don't know if that's cultural or my background is pretty limited, so I couldn't add more to that.
So what about her sister? Does it mean something in Azad?
I don't know. You'd have to look that up later. Sorry.
Yeah, that's really helpful. So anyway, all I was going to say, we might just go to the first arc, which is, on the shorter side. Was anybody struck by the merchant and the demon?
What page are we on?
Also, like starting at 21.
Thanks.
Let's see.
That's one where he accidentally killed the fellow's brother with a peach pit or something.
Yeah, he's eating. Yeah, he's eating the.
Oh, and he throws the stones from something.
Yeah, a date pit.
Yeah,
a date pit.
Yeah.
So basically, the merchants have to tell stories to gain part of the ownership of him.
Mm-hmm.
It seemed to me that there was an awful lot of randomness and it's probably a fairly accurate representation of life, that your things are going along perfectly fine, and then for no apparent reason, all of a sudden you're in major trouble.
Right.
In this case, it's explained by killing a demon's brother with a fig pit.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a seemingly innocent thing to do, right?
Yeah.
An accidental,
right? Not intended. I have to admit, Roxanne was so good about pointing this out, but I'm gonna break the rule a tiny bit. If you think of Chaucer and also the Decameron, when something supernatural happened in those stories, it really stood out, because mostly it was kind of pedestrian, like it was relationships with people. Although we did have a few stories where something crazy did happen, like magic. But I have to admit, I was really struck even in the first part when the two kings are walking, and then out of the ocean comes this demon that's feet are on the ground and heads in the clouds. And I guess I was really struck by the sensational quality of these stories kind of throughout, right? Like anything could happen. That you just reminded me of that, Barry.
What this reminded me of, Andy, was being very young in the Boy Scouts and going to campfire tales. And the best tales were ones that they could be as outlandish as you wanted them to be. As long as some monster might show up and you would be handled during the course of the story, and then the story was self-contained. And I think in these cases, I could see myself sitting around a desert campfire, hiding behind the camels for protection from the wind, and listening to these stories and going, "Oh, that was really a good one."
Yeah, I think that's really good. That's a good example.
And it's interesting that because at first it strikes you as fantastical, but it starts to feel very normal as one tale turns into the next. And it's interesting, maybe even as just a device, that getting the powerful to change from the inside out is in itself sort of fantastic, a fantastic concept. Yeah. And yet when we're talking about these cultural forces and things that are that come from the outside and then somehow move us internally. Even the COVID is a great example. These are external things, and yet they get into us and they move us. And that phenomena alone is fascinating, and it's hard to conceptualize and get there. And the use of the demon and such at least it gives it a device, and it concretizes. I think I just made up a word.
No, that's right.
That very real phenomena for us, or maybe it makes that phenomena more approachable for us.
Yeah.
I just want to do a public service announcement. Please don't drink the Clorox.
We won't.
Thank you.
I was struck by the fact that the most rational stories and the one with the least number of superior people seems to have been Chaucer. Those are stories we might have today. You know, basically is in the time of COVID-0, I guess. And then the Arabian Nights is much more full of evil people doing bad things, people being punished even they didn't do bad things, and the demons. It's a completely different view.
Yeah.
I don't want to go too far afield, but what I also thought of with Arabian Nights was magic realism, and Gabriel Garcia Marquez and the sort of thing that he would do. And specifically, Gabriel Garcia Marquez was asked how he would come about doing magic realism, and he said, well, in Colombia, that's reality. That's the way it really is. And I think that when I read the Arabian Nights, I get the feeling like there is a different culture going on here where this would seem much more, not exactly realistic, but I mean, you very easily get into believing, okay, there's a genie here. It's very easy to accept, at least originally. Yeah. And I think it was probably even easier for the people who were generating the tales.
No, that sounds right. Don, what were you going to say?
Me?
Yeah.
Also, the world in the stories seems it's also a bounded world, right? When a demon appears, it's not the end of the story. It's not he has a supreme power, can control anything, and the human beings are done with it. Once you have stories, you can persuade him.
Yeah.
It seems stories finally is a superpower.
Yeah.
That's a controlled world. It's not a world only controlled by demons.
Right. No, that's a good point. Roxana, what were you going to say?
I was just going to say that one of the things that's so, we've talked about rational versus supernatural, but one of the things that's so interesting about these times is that as we see what Shahrazad's interested in, we have mathematics and philosophy and herbal medicine and astronomy and alchemy, kind of the liberal arts as like, now we see them as like the polar opposites of science and religion. They were not opposites. Mm-hmm. And so you would have people studying supernatural forces and alchemy who are studying concrete mathematics. The Greek ideas had gone up to the Middle East at this point. Yeah. And so it's very hard to kind of be in that world, but it's not or. You would have a logician also casting spells, and it wouldn't be a contradiction in that world, or in the kind of Islamic, Jewish, Middle East kind of understanding or learning. It's a really interesting time for anybody who wants to ever look at all of those things coming together instead of them being polarity.
That's really interesting.
Yeah.
Also, I'm always impressed by the fact that the House of Wisdom in Baghdad during the Abbasid Caliphate was just open to any kind of thing. It was kind of the equivalent of the museum at Alexandria. It was a center of learning in many different ways.
No, that's good. So,
because if you think about it in a way, a lot of it has to do with the storytelling. Whether the COVID is a demon that's come on us, or like we end up describing all of the facets scientifically, we will still use words. And so I don't know. I mean, I'm not saying any more than just look at your assumptions on that, because it's an explanation of something that makes something coherent. And so at some point, even with the scientific, looking at astronomy and the way things change, things used to all be much more story-based for what gave a coherent account. And then that changes into what we have today. But when you go back to these times, you get to look at it and say, did it meet the mark of coherency or order? Again, going back to kingship and keeping things going in a healthy and functioning way or not.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. Well, I was going to suggest that we go the next, that was sort of a small arc. And if we move now to the Fisherman and the Demon, which it kind of starts around 30, it starts at 36. I guess this is we have really 5 tales in here, ending with the enchanted king with those fish and everything. What struck you, or what did you find edifying in this arc?
Well, right off the bat,
yeah,
the king relented almost immediately, and then it's an interesting thing to see how can we, is that relenting going to be a short term, or is it going to be a long term? And it's fascinating that he relents like right off the bat.
What says, you mean he relents saying, "Oh yeah, I want to hear more stories"? Or which?
Yeah, so, I mean, I'm back on page 23. He's like,
okay.
"Well, by God, I must kill you."
Yes.
But then he's like, "Well, next time."
Right. Actually, to build on that point, if you probably noticed this, but later on he says, "Wow, I would keep her alive for a month just to hear the end of the story." He softens. Okay, yeah.
I think that's such an important hinge there, and it's because that's what keeps the entire epic together. It's the bottom of page 23, as you were saying there is, but morning, so it's the end of a story, right? Boom. And then, but morning overtook Shahrazad and she lapsed into silence, leaving King Shahryar burning with curiosity to hear the rest of the story.
Right.
Then Dinarzad said to her sister, they had a plot, right? Then Dinarzad said to her sister Shahrazad, "What a strange and lovely story." Shahrazad replied, "What is this compared with what I shall tell you tomorrow night, if the king spares me and lets me live? Right. It will be even better and more entertaining." So, so the king gives himself permission to do that. I think it's very, to me, it's such an important hinge to the whole thing.
Absolutely.
It's like, he's curious. The story is beautiful, cuts it off. He's dying of curiosity.
And I love the phrasing, morning overtook Shahrazad. So she's not totally in control of this process either.
I thought Dongyu's point was that if you want to say what's the most powerful thing in the story, it's stories, right? So story is this power
exactly.
And maybe as we look at the second set of stories that Andy's bringing up, kind of going back to this idea of curiosity, which repeatedly is brought up as both a problem and a solution to the problem.
Yeah.
So I don't know what this text ultimately tells us about curiosity. There's so many warnings and so many places where we see it being used as a device to save. So maybe we could just think about that, because that theme runs throughout the whole stories.
Yeah.
I don't think it's just mourning that stops Scheherazade. I think she's very deliberate in stopping to keep his curiosity on edge. And she could keep going, but she doesn't, because she wants to live another day.
Right. Well, not only that, she wants to save the kingdom, right?
Well, there's that too.
Yeah.
When she offers herself, her father, the first warning tale that the vizier tells is about a curiosity tale. It's like, don't go where you don't belong or you're going to get killed like the other girls. Right. But she goes forward and she ends up saving everybody. Yeah. But then throughout it, and then she uses this curiosity as this pitch to keep the stories going. But we see it being problematic in so many of the stories, or at least the claim of it being problematic.
For those who have read the entire text, does she get pregnant?
If you go to the last page of the book, you'll see that the tradition is that after 3 years or so, she's pregnant and he loves her and it all works out. So she pulled it off.
Thanks.
They must have been using protection all those 1,000.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. Well, supposedly they had 2 children. So by that point, I think he decided, okay, I'll keep her.
Yeah.
I think on the curiosity thing, I was going to say, it's interesting, right? Because it is like the perfect TV serial, right? Because we all are like, right? And she ends at the perfect. But to Roxanne's point, you also think about the men, the ones that were blinded, that they were warned. They had the perfect situation. They got to be, the man he got to be with these gorgeous women. They had a wonderful time. The women went off and just said, "There's all these rooms. Just you can't go into this one. Oh yes, I'll be wiser." And so the element that I kept seeing through the story is almost this feeling of like predeterminism, right? that we think that we can somehow outwit things. We think that we have free will, but actually we're going to end up in the same spot as the other people.
No, I think that's a really good point. In fact, if you think about, kind of jumping ahead, but that smaller story, the envied and the envious, even if someone's sort of blessed, you can't even put them wrong, right? You think you're throwing them down a well, but
right.
You actually did them a huge favor, that kind of
exactly.
thing. Yeah.
Yes.
That's a good point.
I almost, we're using the word curiosity, but part of me, at least in the example we were just talking about, it seems to be one of like avoiding excess. I mean, you had, what was it, 99 doors to open and 40 days, and you think, just take a little break, don't get too excessive. And in that sense, I get the feeling like, maybe in a contrasting with the predetermined, like there is some volition involved, where if you'd had whatever that internal fortitude is that lets you say, no, I think that's enough. I'm coming to the line and I'm voluntarily stopping. And I'd like to think that door was open, up to a certain point, that both choices were available, maybe against the notion of predestined, but maybe that's the tension.
Yeah, I mean, when you think about it, you've got the Garden of Eden with the apple, you have Pandora's box. And I mean, I think even our own lives, how many of us have sometimes known we shouldn't take a certain path or a certain action, and we can't keep ourselves from it, right?
Yeah. Although, just to go back to Barry's point a while ago, if we look at this tale with the fisherman and the demon, he's not being overly curious, and he's not being excessive. He's just throwing his net in the water trying to make a living, and then all of a sudden his whole life's turned around. So yes, there's something about not being overly curious, but things might just bite you anyway.
Well, what about the fourth cast where he's throwing, it's bad, bad, bad. After 3 times, maybe the lesson is, you know what, do I really have to throw my net 4 times every day? Yeah.
I think he probably does need to throw 4 times every day, but I think when he sort of has a theme within a theme, as well as a story within a story, in that ultimately the fisherman gets himself out of a tight spot the same way Scheherazade does, by using wits and actually by storytelling. Getting the demon to,
there's a helicopter flying over.
Oh, okay. Getting the demon to perform a story and go back into the jar.
Yeah. Please.
Oh, I was just going to say really quick. The point about the fisherman, though, what I liked about it is that often in these stories, the very wise people are actually supposedly the most lowly or uneducated. Right. So in that case, it wasn't that the fisherman was a kind of your curiosity is going to get you in trouble, because he ultimately outwitted the demon.
Yeah.
Well, and what's a really brilliant twist in that too is when we as it transitions into the tale of the fish, how that it goes from this kind of one-on-one thing to involving a whole city.
Right.
The well-being of a whole people is brilliant.
Right.
That's a heck of a transition too, to have to go from the genie to talking fish in a frying pan to the king saving the king from the evil wife.
Right.
That just is quite a tale.
I was if you've ever seen the Psycho, the Alfred Hitchcock movie, I don't think I'm giving anything away, is that your point of reference suddenly is gone, right? So then all of a sudden you think, well, who am I with now? And you're with Anthony Perkins, which is crazy. But I kept thinking about, well, who am I attached to in this whole arc? And of course it's a fisherman, but then he's gone. And then you're in a story within, and but he comes back, of course, at the end of that one moment. But I thought it just holds together in a really crazy way, but it's a long arc. Yeah.
Well, the web, the interconnectedness of a society, the threads, the relational threads that tie everyone together, from the lowest to the highest, seem to kind of get explored here in this fascinating way, in a way that's trackable. Because a lot of times the society's happening, it's way too much for me, and it just kind of goes, and I miss most of it. And but by holding on to this single thread through the different stories, it seems to, you know, help tie everything in.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was interested in the fisherman's explanation of the hierarchy. So on page 42,
okay,
almost to the bottom or in the middle, the fisherman thought to himself, he is only a demon, while I'm a human being whom God has endowed with reason.
Yeah.
And which is kind of interesting because it seems like human beings, especially if they're wandering around outside the city walls, so they're in the desert or they're on the ocean or the sea, and so they're subject to these demonic forces which seem to come out of nowhere. And there's a sense in which God is in charge of the world. The order is a function of God, and God somehow has endowed human beings with a special place within that order.
Yeah. No, I was struck by that too when I read that hierarchy, because mostly what I thought was, well, if the demon's talking, if they have the ability to speak, that's reason, or that's an aspect of reason, right? That's what we normally would say. But maybe, I guess I was thinking, do they have appetite in some way that they can't control or something like that? Maybe that word reason.
They run off with girls a lot.
They what?
They run off with girls a lot.
They run off with girls?
Yeah. On their wedding nights.
On their wedding nights, yeah.
What I found interesting was the theme of these objectively ineffective kings that, you know, can't manage their own houses. They're prone to jealousy, violence, licentiation, and they can't control the situation. Then you've got a young girl, Zirakzadeh, who studied philosophy and medicine, and through forethought, she's able to control the seemingly uncontrollable king who's going to kill her in the morning.
Yeah.
By thinking it out, sort of like Plato's philosopher king. You've got the really corrupt, deteriorating kings that are prone to bad advice from envious counsel, and their faulty logic is exposed. And then you've got somebody who's actually thinking about how to manage a situation and actually exercises courage and puts herself into a difficult situation by thinking it out.
No, yeah, you're pointing out kind of what was said before too, even with the merchant or the fisherman and the demon. Wits really are you really want to keep your wits, right? Or you want to really stay intelligent to get out of these situations, right? Because things are going to happen that you can't control, right? Like you're just throwing your pits around and life comes on you, but you can smart your way out of it.
But everybody's constantly talking about, oh God, the magnificent, the only one who can help us and all that. And yet the demons seem to be on the satanic side and they can't be controlled. They just come out of nowhere.
But you can't invoke God's name with a demon, right? I'm trying to find some place where that was.
Yeah, the fisherman invokes God's name when the demon is out the second time.
Yeah.
And that prevents the demon from killing him.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's interesting because when the sorcerers change human beings back from the animal form to the human being form, it seems like they invoke the name of God to counteract the lesser demonic magic.
No, you're right. That's actually really excellent. It's I think the part you're thinking of is on 77, because I thought this was sort of interesting. By the power of my spell, if the creator has created you in this form, or if he has turned you into this form out of anger at you, stay as you are. But if you have been transformed by my magic and cunning, turn back to your normal form by the will of God, creator of the world. So I think going back to what Roxana said, it's not either or, it's and. Right? So there's magic and God, I guess. That was the point you're trying to make, Mary Jane?
Yes, but I think God is more powerful than magic. At least if you...
Sure, of course.
be on good terms with him and you have to invoke his name in a special way, but he has power over all of these demonic and or magical forces, I think.
Yeah, yeah.
I would suggest that God is good magic, except that it's not automatic. God is good magic with a will. He, she, or it can choose whether or not to restore things to the right.
Yeah.
Whereas bad magic, just it happens on you.
Right.
And these kings who are assertedly divine right then, I'm sure, as were most monarchs, never sought counsel from God on how to deal with their affairs. They were extremely self-centered, self-willed, and ineffective.
Right.
It's interesting about some of the examples we've been looking at, are invoking mercy. And you get the sense that mercy is not just the whim of the powerful, but that there is a morality or a proper path for mercy to happen. And it's interesting, at least in the first series of stories, where none of it happens individually. It all seems to happen in communion or community, like a third and a third and a third, or whatever that phenomena of forgiveness is, or mercy, or properly done.
Right.
If it's something more than just whim, right? And it seems like it is.
Yeah, the insanity of the logic of the fisherman capitulating to the demon and letting him out. I mean, but he doesn't kill him. I mean, the predictable is he fell for the insane logic, the scorpion and the toad tail, and you expect him to get bitten and killed in the end, and he doesn't do it. It's like, maybe there's some kind of honor.
I think he invokes the name of God, doesn't he? He from the seal from the bottle.
Yeah, let's see. James, I took him to be just good-natured. So he was a good-natured person, so he believed, he thought everything was on the up and up, right? So
but he said he wouldn't kill him if he let him out.
Right.
So he honored his word.
Yeah.
Remember, like, he made all the offers that he'd make people rich if they let him out, but then nobody let him out. And eventually he decided he would kill the first person who let him out.
Right.
It's interesting.
Implacable until, he was deceived into getting back in the drum or whatever it was.
You wonder a little about the demon. He's introduced on page 40. Yeah. And when we first meet him, the demon cries out at the bottom of that first paragraph, "Oh, Solomon, prophet of God, forgive me. Never again will I disobey or defy your command." You think the fisherman could have been like, okay, right? But he doesn't. Like, the fact that the demon doesn't recognize that he's not Solomon at first, and he needs a little explaining, makes me wonder, how easy is it to fool this demon?
Yeah, Barry, the part I think you were looking at was on page 59.
Okay.
After the fisherman secured the demon's pledge by making him swear by the almighty name, he opened the seal of the jar and smoke began to rise.
They did pledge a covenant together on 59, the bottom of the first or the second paragraph. It says, the demon replies, "Set me free this time, and I pledge never to bother you or harm you, but to make you rich." When he heard this, the fisherman made the demon pledge and covenant that if the fisherman released him, he'd let him out. Now, I don't know what the substance of the covenant is. Maybe I haven't, but there is definitely a promise that's going on there.
Yeah.
Oh, he did. He swears by the name of the Almighty. Here we go.
The demon did?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I guess I'm a little curious as we're reading these stories. They do seem not just far away in time and mood and place and fantastic creatures and kings that none of us are. And that's when I started reading them, they seemed that way. But a lot of the stories or the emotions, at least for me, didn't feel so unusual. And I was curious if anybody else related to that. I mean, I'm not a king. So if somebody cheats on me and I'm so mad that I want to kill them, which could be how my emotion starts, that first moment that I experience that, I would have consequences or limited power. So it's possible I wouldn't be able to enact on that. Yeah. But a king in the story is just unrestrained power. And then when the impulse comes and it's lit up to such a level, that's the demonstration of it. And I just was wondering, I mean, we've all been just talking about him as this kind of inept or irrational or uncontrollable king from, you know, hundreds of years ago. But even today, getting cheated on is just the most average thing that happens to all kinds of people everywhere. Right. And it creates just great fire and anger, you know, and there's so much so that there's murder created by it. And many of these stories have similar things. And I just was wondering if any of it rang with anybody other than it being so kind of foreign.
I think the murder out of passion, if we take the first brother, the murder out of passion is a fairly common occurrence, and we'll find reports of that in the Ventura County Star, the Los Angeles Times. The preemptive slaughter of every woman you sleep with is over the top. That I think we would define as a sociopath.
Right. Right.
If you have the power, you're not going to do that.
Right.
Yeah.
I guess I'm with you, Roxana, in the sense that it just feels pretty natural. The stories felt natural to me. And I think, Barry, again, you were kind of saying, the first time I encountered a demon, I thought, this is really exciting and unusual. But then I stopped being dazzled by them because they're in so many of the stories, right? So it became, this is how the world works. So as far as keeping me as a reader, they all did it. Really.
The reality is internally consistent. The genies consistently do unusual, but yet things that you come to expect from them. They behave in ways that you come to expect. Right. So it's if you have a willing suspension of disbelief, you have the ability to step into the story, and it becomes your reality for as long as you're in the book.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I had the feeling that the book was influenced, not to violate the rule, was influenced by Plato's Republic, that these kings were presented as being in a downward spiral, like the progression of the tyrant, just completely ineffective to accomplish anything because they're self-centered, self-interested, and that's not the type of ruler that should be governing. And I thought that Shahrazad, the young lady, was presenting like forethought and a wisdom. She really had no stake in it. She was, she put herself at risk for the benefit of the community, hoping that maybe she could accomplish something, very altruistic, like, the philosopher king, somebody that doesn't own anything, that lives in a deliberative state where through philosophy and concentrating on what's good for the polity, is best. That was what I thought. There was a heavy influence in terms of the themes.
James, I would suggest almost like a Jungian perspective, which would just say that at the beginning you have this guy who's out of control. That's the sensuous physical nature. But then you have Shahrazad, who is clearly the brains of the outfit, and she comes together with him. And when you put the two of them together, you actually have a couple that could reign over a kingdom effectively. Because you've got the brains, you've got the power, and Shahrazad provides the brains. I think in a weird, in an unexpected sort of way, this becomes almost a feminist story.
Well, and ostensibly through their marriage and through their child, their son would be the next king. So you have the story of the kings. I don't know the story of that king if it ended up being a virtuous king, but as you're pointing out, you have the marriage of those two forces or those two archetypes. Mm-hmm. And something's being provided by that in a situation, even if you live in a world where there's no king, if you have an unrestrained or unchecked power coming, what are your choices and what are the possibilities for engaging with that energy?
It's like the unity of, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Oh, it's like the unity of might is right and wisdom.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, talking about the
I just want to say, like, what else can we say about that kind of wisdom? Like, what are some of the characteristics of it? I mean, we could even, we've talked about her a little bit, but throughout the story, like, it's not, you know, it's not a philosophical treatise. It comes through story. Like, what are some of those aspects of this kind of wisdom that comes, you know, because this is pre-Plato. There isn't like a question about what virtue is. We have individuals and we have stories and we have lots of particular examples of things in context. So we get to kind of look at those in time. We're not looking at like a beautiful abstract Greek painting and a distillation. So what are some of those characteristics that are coming in through these stories? I'd love to.
Well, it's the reflective wisdom through the story, the moral, you know, sort of what like Nietzsche's theme in Birth of Tragedy, that there's a lot to be gained from the story of life as they're told. And it's not
I think it's
Mary Jane.
Go ahead.
I think it's interesting that she is not a king's daughter. She's a commoner. I think someone mentioned the wisdom of the fisherman. So I wonder if there's a sense in which somehow the wisdom of the people has to fertilize or to inform the kingly realm in order to be effective.
There's oft in the fisherman story, he makes the claim quite often, you don't return a good with an evil, even though you don't have, like the demon could just, I'm so powerful, you did right by me, but I'm powerful enough that I don't have to do right by you. And in the end, the demon does end up doing right by him, leading him to the fish. And he maybe a little less knowingly ends up doing right by all of those people, because by bringing that to the king, he gets enriched, but then the whole kingdom gets restored. I mean, so there is a really interesting, there's this notion of balance, regardless of your station in life, that there's certain things you don't return a good with a bad, and you show mercy to people, and it seems to then ripple out.
Yeah.
Roxana, your awareness of how the story was moved along in increments of that led you to a more belief system. The stories became more reality as it moved along, and I was also curious of how this was handled sexually too. If he had blatantly come out with the last stories we read in this section, that would have been holy cow. And then where do you go from here? And so I'm wondering if there are other themes that we will become aware of as we read more.
I mean, I think this came up in the other readings too, without going into the detail of the other. There's all these seemingly shocking things that come up in these stories through Boccaccio, through Chaucer, through here, that seem to be taboo or shocking, except we all know exactly what they are. Nobody has to go look up what the term means. So there is a way in which they're so familiar to everybody. So these are common stories and things that happen, but we always think they're the exception, or it's weird, or it's the other somehow. And so these stories in a way knock that door of otherness, and whether they can entertain or shock or bring us in means, what is our relationship of like the everyday to these fantastic, very like 100 different stories in the Decameron, all the different characters in Chaucer, all the fantastic events here. It's not so different than me that I don't understand it. But there's different in some way, and I guess I'm curious about that relationship.
Well, and I am too, because we're having a similar situation politically as it started out of little things, and we have been increasingly numbed or open to accepting more and more things that we would not have done in the beginning. And so as I looked at, I mean, I just found all these sexual scenes extremely entertaining. And yet I thought, holy cow, if this had started with this last story we read, and I look at what's going on today, if we had been bombarded as a people with what's going on today 3 years ago, you know, we're accepting more and more as more and more is presented in increments. And I was just curious of a comparison here.
No, Roxana, that was excellent that you brought that up. I thought too that how we have gotten eased into some of the more explicit scenes, right? So by design or whatever, as Paula just pointed out. And yeah, I wasn't surprised because of what we've been reading, but they were entertaining, and it was, not shocking. And say that again?
I said, and amazing. The word amazing story keeps coming up. Like the standard for a story is that it's weird and amazing and entertaining and even more strange. These are the words that our text provides or our characters provide, which are really interesting.
Right.
Go ahead, Andy. I'm sorry.
No. I was gonna just say one thing about when Sean was talking about the demon with the fisherman. On page 60, this is the end of that part of the story. And then he says, the demon says to the fisherman, take them to this is after he showed him the fish. Take them to the king of your city and offer them to him, and he will give you enough to make you rich. Please excuse me, for I know no other way to make you rich. But don't fish here more than once a day. So that's to not be overindulgent. Then saying, I shall miss you. The demon kicked the ground with his foot, and it opened and swallowed him. So again, I thought you were kind of making the point. The demon actually keeps his promise, and he's affectionate. So that was really cool. I like that.
It is. I think there is. This doesn't present a system of values by the way you would get it from John Locke or John Stuart Mill.
Yeah.
But if you take the stories as a mosaic and then look at what the values are across the whole, there are certain things that do stand out. There's a value placed on wit. There's a value placed on knowing your place in the hierarchy. There's a requirement to trust in God and accept whatever God gives you. There are different values that you can see in the different places, and I think they're pretty consistent. Women fare better depending upon their level in society. For the most part, knowledge is very, very helpful for them, whether it be the book learning of Scheherazade or the witchcraft of the king's daughter who ocean because it paying for.
And don't forget sex. I mean, that seems to be a great equalizer. I was looking at the beginning of the story of the porter and the three ladies.
Yeah.
And the juxtaposition of social roles and relationships is fascinating. And I think there's a lot of lessons there for us, where you have the porter, the servant, who very quickly almost gets treated like a guest or a person of great honor. And then you have these people from all these different walks of life come in as princes, former princes come in as supplicants. You have the king and his vizier come in, and at one moment they're like, it's just these girls, let's take them out. And the next moment they're all about to get their heads cut off. So you have these people in power going from positions of power to positions of dependency and vice versa. And I can't help but think of the word maybe empathy starts to develop, or there's something healthier in their understanding of how to relate to other people that starts to maybe become a positive.
So about the porter, if you look on page 85, so he's just a porter, right? He's just carrying the stuff, and that was his job, and it was accidental how the shopper found him. But then this line, this is after they think he maybe should go, and he says, when the porter heard their words, he replied, trust me, I am a sensible and wise man. I've studied the sciences and attained knowledge. I have read and learned and presented my knowledge and cited my authorities. I reveal the good and conceal the bad, and I am well behaved. I am like the man of whom the poet, etc. So I don't know, maybe we don't believe him all the way, but he doesn't seem to do anything wrong until they're all drunk, right? Then maybe he gets a little lazy, but he's going along with them, right? I thought, Roxana, when you were asking the question, what are lessons come out of this, or what do we see? I thought one of them was that women are very potent, right, in these stories. So, I mean, they're potent sexually, but they have power and strength and like I said, in some cases wit. So that I was just continually struck by what women can do, obviously with their beauty, but with their minds.
Andy. Yeah. Sorry, Sean, go on.
it opens up our understanding of what power is, because it's not just being able to beat someone with a stick,
For sure.
right? I mean, and the kingly authority is kind of presented at first in that as just raw physical power, but you see raw physical power getting tamed by these other forces.
Yeah. Dangi, what were you saying?
Yeah, I was trying to say that following what you said, women are powerful, but it seems they're only powerful as wives. And we don't say mothers. You know, they have, correct me if I'm wrong, so far I don't say their mothers have influence on their sons. Like when the king killed all the wives, I don't say his mother stepped out and said, don't do this. And only wives, women as wives, it seems they're powerful.
Yeah.
And fortunately, Scheherazade was not ugly.
Yeah.
You know, you go to Shrek and that story there.
Right.
Yeah.
No, I mean, yeah, having good looks gets you far also.
Were there any female demons?
Oh, I didn't see it. I don't.
No, no.
There's the she-ghoul. There's the she-ghoul. Remember that?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, that was gross.
There seems to be a desire for the story from like learning from experience. Like in several of the stories, will tell me the story. And there was a benefit to be achieved from telling the story, like evolving to like an experiential knowledge, you know, like a revival of the Greek theme of wisdom through suffering. Everybody wanted to hear the story.
Right.
Has that changed?
Yeah.
Even in our contemporary times? Is that like an old-fashioned modality? Story for all the, I mean, maybe we could talk about all the ways the story is invoked in this story as the benefits of the story are said. What are some of the benefits according to this story of stories?
Yeah.
Well, to show how the kings were faulty in their logic, like listening to the envious counselor, you know, being deceived.
Well, but what's interesting though is I remember there's a few times when I wrote, "You're going to tell a story now?"
Yeah.
Like if I said, "Oh, listen, you should really clean up your bookshelf," and then you're like, "Well, let me tell you a story about why I shouldn't."
But don't kids do that? I have kids. Kids precisely do that to avoid. It is even today. It's like I'll ask my kids to clean a bookshelf, and a story does indeed come.
You tell the story, or they do?
They do. They just start. It could be a distraction. It could be something, and if it gets my mind off of it, it's a successful story.
Yeah.
I was impressed by the story of the three apples. The idea that there were some actions precipitated by false knowledge, fake news, if you will.
Yeah.
And
Yep. Well, I mean, I guess I like telling stories, and well, my kids, if I'm old, and that might be old-fashioned, but my kids, if we're all out, basically I have a story for every occasion.
And what's so wonderful is as we age and we hear the same story, we understand more. Yeah. And that's the beauty of folk tales. You go around the campfire and Dad, tell me a story, or tell me the story about, and the child has already heard that story.
Yeah.
And so we know at any age, the more we are aware, the more we are aware.
But go ahead. No.
Sorry, and even, you know, my father is 85 and he's on the border of losing his memory. And when I go to his house, he has such a deep desire to share stories in this time in his life. That's all he wants. He'll just want to go through, and in a way it's a new impulse. I mean, not that he hasn't told stories before, but all I do is I go over there and he just wants to share some particular stories with me from when he was young. And I'm not sure they're lessons. They don't seem that pointed, but it seems to do something so curative and important in him. And it seems to be such an honor for me to be able to be there, to just be there for him in that time. But it's interesting. And then of course my kids are 10 and 9, but they grew up in stories. And so as I look at the bookends of life, it seems very natural in the beginning and towards the end. And so I don't know what more to say about that, except that's just been my experience with my little ones and now with my father.
Well,
And
I'm fascinated with legacy.
About how we do it today. Do we?
Sorry, one person, everybody.
Oh,
James,
is
go
there
ahead.
emphasis on the story today? I don't think so. I think we're in a culture where the benefit of the story is kind of waned or fallen to the wayside.
I disagree.
Yeah, I'm
I think
fascinated
there's
with
movies or
legacy.
stories, TV.
Wait, sorry. So Sean, go ahead, and then Joanne go.
So I'm fascinated with the legacy, like how the past and the present and maybe the future are connected. And it seems to me, I've been dealing with this with my kids, trying to show them legacy. And one of the ways I've explained it is someone is so passionate about something in life and they share it with someone. And then we have to receive that. And I think this is the stuff of story. And it's funny, and I don't know what it fully means to receive something. And yet we get filled with it to a point then where we can pass it on to someone else. And that seems to be the mechanism of history. And it's magical. It can be frozen in carvings on a wall, and to be able to share in a feeling or experience from 1,000 years ago as if it were happening in this moment is magic. I mean, I don't know what else to describe it as. And yet, obviously, it's real and it's there. The collective human experience is something we all share, and we're sharing in it right now. And it is. I mean, maybe there are, these things, demons, genies, she-ghouls, and God are all part of this, or any, maybe ways to make it this universal beingness happen. And the funny thing is you be it. You can be trained to become a soccer player, and then you become one. You can train philosophy to become a philosopher, and it's not so much the reading, it's the being of it that's fascinating. And that seems that being gets handed or passed off or given and received from one to another.
Joanne.
I think stories are how we organize our thoughts. We communicate our culture and our ideas, and we are watching movies and Netflix all the time. Those are stories. We're reading stories. We're telling stories around the dinner table. I can't remember the name of the book, but there was an author who said that's how we think, is we have our story, and when new input comes in, we have to fit it in with the existing story or modify the story to make room for it. But that's how our brains can hang on to things, is through the mechanism of a story.
Okay.
Beautifully said.
I wanted to kind of prolong what Sean was saying. And this is an extraordinary collection of stories that were written. But before that, they were just oral stories. And just like the Iliad or the Odyssey, they were oral transmissions. And I think there is something very powerful in that communication, particularly in the age of text messaging, which we all live in. And I think it, even before writing became a means of communication in the 16th century, and stories could be printed and multiplied and not just manuscripted for 50 noblemen who had the money to buy those illuminated manuscripts, actually, who were flourishing in the Arab world, just as they were. I'm trained in art, so I easily go on that tangent. So the magnificent illuminated manuscripts, which transmitted so much of Western culture, transmitted so much of the Arab world. And they were the story of kings, like Roxana. It was always the story of kings. But the power of a transmission from parents to children or grandparents to children, the night time when stories were told, I think has had the power also to protect the recipient of a story from some absolutely horrific things, murders and heads falling and, and demons appearing and all of that, because it was done in a way that it still can be done, where the recipient of a story, let's say the children that receive that from an elder, feel they are protected in the transmission because it is delivered by somebody who they know loves them.
I think that's beautiful. I'm sorry, Anka. I was going to say beautifully said.
Oh, thank you. I'm just gleaning from my own readings here. And the stories have been, you know, I'm very fascinated with translations. And I grew up with a father who was a very literate, very cultured man. And he would read bedtime stories to my brother and me at night. And the Arabian Nights was my favorite story. And just, I couldn't wait for the next night to hear it. I could not
read all of them though, right? He censored some of the stories, I presume.
What's that?
He censored some of the stories, I presume.
He read from a children version.
Okay.
And then when in my teenage years, I got a better version, the Galant, the French version of Galant, which I'm looking right here, Les Mille et Une Nuits in French, which was one of the great translations, and then the English translation, the Burton and all of that. But it's the fact that these have been written, and the introduction that he makes to this, the translator, oh God, what's his name? The translator of his book, this particular version, I can't think of his name right now. He writes a very, very beautiful introduction about the translations and how difficult it was for him to bypass somehow the language of the translators before him, who were automatically sticking to more traditional storytelling formats, and that was trying to recapture the folksy quality of the Arabic language in it. And it has, and also the nobility. So it's a mix of the nobility and the folksy quality, like it appears so much in the stories. But I think I never forget when I read something like that, that these were stories that were told.
Yeah.
And just like the kids couldn't wait for the next one, the king cannot wait for the next one. And it goes back.
I think Michelle was pointing out earlier that, you know, serial TV has really taken this huge lesson, right? And there were times when I would watch a show at night, and you know, the word's cliffhanger, right? It ends on a cliffhanger, and I would just keep. And now with Netflix, you just watch the next one, and all of a sudden it's 2:00 in the morning. It's
Andy, it's called binge watching.
Yeah, no, right, exactly. But the stories are designed to keep you watching, right?
Right.
They don't quite conclude,
right.
So they keep you going.
But I'd like to try to figure out, though, you know, stories can be quote unquote realistic, but these stories are more, there's a kind of dream logic to them.
Mm-hmm.
Or, you know, you go into a magic mount or a magnetic mountain, or you go into a palace and it's enchanted in some way. And that seems very important. And actually, maybe it's just my own temperament, but I feel that the world is an enchanted place. And sometimes I feel like prosaic daily reality is sort of imposed on us, but it's not really what's going on. I think, to me, like, it has a dreamlike quality, has an enchanted quality.
Right.
Yeah, Mary Jane, I wanted to kind of piggyback on that idea too. I think we often, even when we think about things as moral tales, we translate it into information as if it's just a manual, like it's just giving you a moral lesson. But there are so many dimensions invoked in these stories about the uses of the story. I think Anka just talked about protection. There's shields in several places. Someone's going to get killed, and they talk themselves out. They talk the person out of that by a story. It's like you get that pause, and you can use your wit or your story to change literally the atmosphere of the times. And then there's the loneliness. People want to communicate out of their loneliness. I mean, the dervish stories are really, really interesting. People who are at the ends or at the limits of their life go all the way to Baghdad to find somebody to tell their story to. And I just wanted to know if anybody could relate to that or had experiences like of today, or if it felt like that too felt very fantastic. The loneliness, both from the receiver and from the teller of the story, of what that does for human beings.
I had an experience of that with actually a neighbor when I lived in Virginia. He used to tell me the story of his life, and it took me a long time to realize it was a form of validation. And he wanted to tell it to me because while I was 15, 20 years younger, I'd been an aviator, I'd been in combat, I had a PhD. There was all these things that he wanted the appropriate audience to tell his story to. And I think a lot of these stories start out as that. Somebody wants their own story told and appreciated. You know, it's the old bit about every first novel is autobiographical.
James Joyce said all novels are autobiographical.
Well,
yes.
I had the honor of being hired to write the story of a World War II codebreaker. And one day he called and he said, I am sitting in Central Park reading our book, and this is the greatest legacy I am leaving my family. And he was a multimillionaire, but this was the most precious in his life. Okay. And it has taught me to, and as a result, I give a free 2-hour workshop on helping people tell their story, not through a diary, not through a journal, through a fun, quick, and easy way, because I am so passionate about just what you're saying. Everyone has a story that is valuable, and we forget, and we don't, our children don't know who we are as people. You know, it isn't until we die, and that nobody knows how to write our eulogy because nobody knows anything about us, really. And so one of my exercises is you need to write your own obit.
I'm gonna lie.
What'd you say, Barry?
I'm gonna lie.
Oh, okay. You're allowed. You're allowed. You're dead.
There's a lot of lying regardless, Barry.
That's right.
Michelle.
Well, also, I was just going to say, kind of, you touched on too, besides legacy, also, we know from like the Holocaust that the whole act of recording or sharing or telling stories is our way of memorializing things that have happened.
Yeah.
And we are often at a loss when we have no written or, record of something, because then what happened can also be twisted or denied.
Yes, absolutely.
But so often, I mean, obit or just the facts, ma'am. She was born, she went to school, she has kids, but did she see a vision of God? So, I mean, the type of story is also very important, and for me, this collection, I just think it's touching on aspects, the supernatural aspects of life that we don't really talk about. And that in some strange way, this is reality.
Yeah, I'm struck by that too, that it's not just zeros and ones, like a raw data exchange. It comes with feeling, and with feeling, I think, comes empathy and maybe even a mode of being, where it's like a remanifestation of something that was, and it's fascinating. It's fascinating to participate in things that people have been participating in and manifesting since people have been people.
There's one piece of text that I was hoping that we would get to, and the writing, the conversation about writing is helpful. It's on page 128. And actually, we were talking about this. We were saying, you have the long arc of this kind of story, which, and then, you know, it's her telling, it's Shahrazad telling the story, and then you have this long arc, and then there's stories within the stories. But then you also have these verses that are happening everywhere as a kind of a story that gets invoked, or a verse. But the one that really struck me was, there is no writer who from death will flee, but what his hand has written, time will keep. Commit to paper nothing then except what you would like on Judgment Day to see.
Oh, great.
So yes, right, I guess, but write well.
And tell.
Right, well, yeah, easily said.
I thought, Andy, No, go ahead.
Okay. I was picking up on what a couple of you were talking about, the supernatural quality of life and the dream. I think, I'm sorry, I don't know everybody here. Mary Jane, I think, was talking about the dream quality and so on. And I'm thinking how the story within the story is really like dreams that we have at night.
Yes,
the story
right.
within the story. And the dream-like quality, which is, I don't know how many of you are heavy dreamers. I'm a real super dreamer in CinemaScope and in color. And sometimes I wake up and I don't know what's more real, the light around me or what just happened in the dream. And of course, there is a wonderful, wonderful book called the Calderon book, La vida es un sueño, Life is a Dream, which is an extraordinary book. I think about the same time, right? That this collection was written about 15th century or something like that. I may be off a century. and the whole premise is his prince is involved in an action. It's not until much later he realized it was a dream. And so the quality of life as a dream, and I think it's running through this, and it makes the stories tolerable, as I was attempting to say before, but it also, the fact that all the stories are taking place at night, yes? He welcomes her, they have sex, and then in the middle of the night, before dawn or something, she starts telling the story. So it's the dream-like quality. It's that time of dreams.
No, that's interesting. Barry, what were you going to say?
I was, where you commented, Andy, on there's no writer who from death will flee, but what its hand has written, time will keep, made me think of T.S. Eliot in the Four Quartets. And the point that Eliot was making is that we live life, we see life in the present, but time in the past doesn't cease to exist, which means that everything that you've done has the permanence that time has. So you're sort of condemned to an inescapable immortality, at least until time is destroyed. So write whatever you're going to write as well as you can write it, because you're going to have to live with it until long after you've died.
And I just want to add, I think there is a tale, which I don't remember which one it is because I haven't reread the whole book in a day and a half, but there is a very important tale in there where a vizier is under the bad spell of a bad magician, and he goes and has these horrible adventures. He's turned into a monkey, then he's turned into a beggar, and he all these horrible life experiences happen to him, and then he comes back, and he is in his court, surrounded by his courtiers. And do you guys know the story I'm talking about? I think it's much later in the book. And then he's so upset and he wants to kill the magician. Said, "How could you do this to me?" Because he put some water on him, I think, and it made him go in this world. And he lived several lives, and all these horrible things happened to him. And he wants to kill him for putting him through these many lives of things. And the magician said, "But sire, you were just gone for 1 second. and said it's impossible. And all the people around said, yes, you were. It was just a second or a few seconds. And they're all testifying to that. And then there is this, I think, this wonderful commentary on the fact that life is very circular. And I think in the Arab philosophy, life is circular. And there is a circularity to it, which comes in these tales. I'm not remembering exactly on my readings about the Arab philosophies, but it's not linear, it's circular.
Yeah.
And the stories do that magnificently, because it's like, it keeps on turning, and we don't know what's real and what's a dream.
Yeah.
You know what's beautiful about story too, is you can take, you know, a principle like don't return a good with an evil, and then we can actually manifest that in our realities and give what might have been at first dreamlike or fantasy an existential, a real sense of a real manifestation in being. It's fascinating.
Yeah. Yeah.
I wanted to admit one of my, you know, you look at these old stories and they always teach you something about your own ignorance of your time. So I'm originally from the Middle East, and reading all these Middle Age stories, one of my, I have to confess, like, obvious thoughts was, wow, they had that kind of sex, that like they knew about all that stuff. So there's like that moment, and of just total ignorance. Like, of course they've known about it since the beginning of time. You know, you think because everything's allowed on TV now, or you could wear anything you want now, that somehow you have more freedom. And I guess I just want to make sure we get to this aspect of the stories, which is just how erotic they are, you know, not just in this, but in the other stories, that they're often at nighttime. Of course, these are all in bed, you know? And so, and then there's this working back and forth between what is said and what is not said, you know, flirting with language, flirting with stories. And yes, you could watch anything on our TV where everything is explicit, but in a way that's not very sexy. You know, it's this playing back and forth with the moonlight and the night, and what is kept hidden and what is not. And you think about a culture where women are veiled, and just the jingling of their ankles would drive you crazy. And it just made me revisit, like in a very visceral way, you know, just the intimate, not just from a loneliness standpoint, but the intimate connection of people that come through stories, you know, the flirting and the love and the erotic sentiment. And again, how stories aren't just reduced to just information or lessons or plans or even like memorials you want to leave behind, but that they're these live beings between human beings. And all of us get to binge watch as much TV as we want, and we could look at whatever rating we want, but it's not the same somehow. You know, you're not connecting with another human being with their stories, and it's just different. So I just feel like, I feel really silly that I thought that, you know, women in the 13th century from the Middle East would be all like, I was like the king. I was exactly like the king when I started. I didn't think that happened to anyone. Right. And of course, everybody's known about everything since the beginning of time. And these stories are really wonderful because of that. They connect.
Yeah.
Hey, well,
I do ancient world civs, and I was thinking the same thing to myself. I had such a monolithic, like, yeah, this was a very, I'm going to finish this book, by the way. Just
great.
So you know.
Yes, absolutely.
Well,
Joan, please, Joan, send me your contact info before you go, because I lost your card. Joanne?
Okay, I was going to say it's 2:00 and I want to keep us on track, but this is an idea. Roxana actually brought it up a year ago, maybe, or longer, saying, oh, we should do a whole series of seminars called The Story Within the Story. And it was, and really this idea is, this question is, what can stories do that philosophy can't? That kind of notion, right? Or what a lecture can't. And I think we've done it. We've talked about what it can do. Do you want to say anything, Roxana?
No, I think I ended with arousal, and I think that's a good
That's perfect.
Yeah.
But maybe we'll find some, we'll kind of look around. The Decameron was absolutely new to me. I hadn't even heard of it, so that was really fun to read. And we'll keep, you know, maybe we'll just keep going with the series and find some more that we can do.
And maybe we'll share too. We read the Decameron, some of the tales from the Decameron. The author is Boccaccio. Some of the tale from Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. But the order wasn't necessary in the sense that they're referring to others. So if you like this and you want to also read any of those stories, I mean, other people can speak to them, but it's, it's really wonderful.
Yeah. Well, thank you all very much. And I used to do this. I'm going to start doing it again. I used to send a survey to everybody just saying, oh, what did you like and what didn't you like? And what would you like to read in the future? So I'm going to email everybody. Anyway, it was really a pleasure to have you here today. Thanks for sticking it out.
Thank you, Andy.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. It was wonderful.
Thank you.
Okay. Thanks. Talk to you soon.
Joni, send me your email. Did you get that message, please?
Yeah. Do you have a